I'm introducing you to Kate Nelson. Kate is the wildlife health biologist with the BC Wildlife Health Program based in Nanaimo. She joined the BC Wildlife Health Program in 2006 and now leads priority wildlife disease surveillance programs such as chronic wasting disease and bovine tuberculosis. Kate is dedicated to working with stakeholders, First Nations, agencies, and researcher collaborators to ensure that all have access to current and accurate facts on priority wildlife health issues and an opportunity to provide input on wildlife health initiatives in BC. Chronic wasting disease is a challenging and complicated issue that is having negative effects in several places around North America and elsewhere. BC is not immune to the threat of CWD, but we do have an opportunity to be proactive and work together to reduce risks and negative impacts as much as possible. So folks, I'm just going to quickly run through a little bit of how this is going to work tonight. We are going to have a presentation by Kate, and then there is a chat button at the bottom of your screen. And that chat button will be your opportunity to pose your questions towards the end of the webinar. As you pose your questions, I'm going to promote your profile to panelist. That's going to bring you on screen. I would like you to turn on at least your audio and if possible your video, and you will have the opportunity to ask Kate and have a discussion around your questions directly with her. So with that, everybody, Kate Nelson. Kate, thanks for taking the time this evening to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Amberly. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you good.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming out to learn about chronic wasting disease. Really appreciate that and appreciate the opportunity to share this information. So as Amberly said, I do lead the chronic wasting disease program for BC, but I certainly don't do it on my own. I have a huge team of people supporting this work. You know, that starts with our BC Wildlife Health Program, the provincial wildlife veterinarian and other biologists that work for the program, regional staff, volunteers, all of our partners across the province. So it really is a big team effort, and I'm just happy to have had the invitation to talk to you about it tonight. Okay, sorry, my slides are just not advancing here. Let's see if that works. There we go. Okay, so just a really quick overview of what I'll cover tonight. I know many of you are well aware of chronic wasting disease, but I'd like to just review some of the basics. We're going to talk a little bit about risks and prevention. Then I'll describe our surveillance in wildlife that we are doing in BC. And then we'll talk a bit about a response to a CWD positive detection in the province. Now, first, I really want to highlight the important role of that hunters play in, let's say, all wildlife health initiatives, but particularly in chronic wasting disease. Surveillance, prevention, all of it. Hunters are incredible advocates for wildlife and do so much great work for wildlife conservation around the province. Hunters are our main source of samples for testing. They are our eyes and ears on the ground, both, you know, telling us what they're seeing, but also, you know, giving us feedback on you know, what it means to them and what they're hearing on the ground. So really important. Hunters are a really important mechanism for information sharing among hunting groups and with fellow hunters, but feeding that information back to us and our government-led programs is really, really important for success. It's important that hunters understand that their actions in the context of CWD do have impacts. They can both threaten and protect the wildlife here from CWD, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Hunting is really one of the only feasible management tools in the fight against Cwd. So the input from hunters and support from hunters is incredibly vital to the success of this program and to protecting BC wildlife from Cwd. So chronic wasting disease is an infectious neurological disease. It affects the species in the deer family, or cervids, but most cases have impacted deer. There are fewer cases in moose and elk, although we know they are susceptible. It's a very difficult disease to detect because especially in early introductions of the disease, it really affects a small percentage of the animals, or at a low prevalence. And so it's really hard to detect. You need to test a lot of animals to be able to pick up any positive cases in early introductions. And then once it is established, containing and managing it is incredibly challenging. The concern is there are long-term population effects and potential declines, because the disease is fatal in 100% of the cases. So when you start to see prevalence, or the proportion of animals reaching 20–30% of a population, then over time you will see that population level decline. And chronic wasting disease not only threatens wildlife conservation, but it also threatens hunting traditions, wildlife-related businesses that rely on that healthy wildlife resource, and maybe most importantly, food security. And that's a really big concern in this context. So chronic wasting disease is a prion disease. It's caused by an abnormal misfolded protein called a prion. These prions are shed from an infected animal through bodily fluids, as well as through carcasses that can decompose in the environment, and the prions get into the environment that way. In an infected animal, they'll accumulate in the brain, leading to this neurological disease, and it's always fatal. There's still no treatment or vaccine for Cwd. Now, one of the unique and challenging things about prions is, particularly when they get into the environment, is that they are essentially impossible to destroy. They are very resistant to disinfectants. Burning doesn't get rid of them or make them deactivate their infectivity. And so they can remain infectious in soil, in the environment, in water, on plants, and remain there for several years, where they could then expose healthy cervid populations, even if there aren't infected animals on that landscape. If the prions are in the environment, in the soil, healthy animals could pick it up that way. Infected animals are sometimes called silent carriers, and this is another tricky aspect of this disease, is that most animals that test positive appear healthy. And, I hear this from hunters often that have harvested a deer in Alberta, for example, is later tested positive, and they say, but it looked so good, it was in such good condition. But in reality, we actually rarely see sick animals in the wild. The image on the bottom left there is an animal infected with Cwd in the later stages, but this is in a captive facility, and we don't tend to see animals in this kind of condition in the wild, because as soon as they start to show any vulnerability, they're often picked off by a predator. And so they're referred to as the infected animals are referred to as these silent carriers, because they're on the landscape, they're infected, they're shedding this infectious prion into the environment, passing it between animals, but there's no outward symptom or sign. Those don't tend to develop until 18 or more months after infection. And in the late stages, usually only last for a couple weeks at what we call the clinical stage, at the end of the disease. And that's when you start to see this extreme weight loss, poor coordination, trembling, frequent drinking, things like that. But again, these symptoms only present for a very short period of time at the very late stage of the disease. So we're trying to address this through some outreach, and we have a new poster that we've produced recently called Can You Spot the Difference? And it's really just addressing this concept that there's really no way to tell if in most cases, if an animal is infected with chronic wasting disease, because they can look and appear totally healthy. Another concern around chronic wasting disease is the potential for it to be transmitted to people. So I'm not a human health expert, and so I really rely on our public health partners with the BC CDC, First Nations Health Authority, the Ministry of Health, and other human health experts to help us review and address concerns and make sure that we're up to date on the current evidence of human transmission. Currently, the different studies that have been done have been inconclusive. There's no direct evidence that humans can get CWD, and there's never been a case. But some of the studies that they've done with transmission to non-human primates have been inconclusive. Some have demonstrated a potential for transmissions and others haven't. There was this report released in June of 2021 from the Canadian Agriculture and Agri-Food sector that really does a good job of summarizing our current knowledge of human health risk. And so it's a good resource to kind of review recent studies and pull all that information together. But what the public health experts are saying is that with chronic wasting disease and really prion diseases in general, there's much still that we don't know about them. And so precautionary approach is really warranted, and because they can't completely rule out human transmission. And so when an animal tests positive, the advice is that those animals should not be eaten. So of course, this again presents a risk to food security. Even in the absence of direct evidence that humans can get this disease, if an animal tests positive, it's a strong recommendation that that animal is not eaten. So that's concerning for food security. So here is the latest map from the US Geological Survey. This is from the National Wildlife Health Center in Wisconsin, and another really excellent resource. So you can just Google USGS CWD map, and they update the map about once a month. So this is the map from this month, and this is the current situation of CWD. Sure you're aware it was first detected in Colorado and Wyoming in the 1960s. It's spread around North America through the wild and through captive or farm populations, eventually being introduced into Canada in the 1990s, and has been spreading through captive populations as well as the wild since then. You'll notice in this map that we've had some jurisdictions that have recently detected their first cases of CWD. That includes Manitoba, detected their first case of CWD a few weeks ago. And just last week, Idaho has now confirmed 2 cases of CWD. But where we have really been paying close attention is watching the spread of CWD moving westward across Alberta over the last 15 years. And then, of course, in 2019, the detection of CWD in Northwest Montana in the Libby area. That was the first time it was ever detected on this side of the Rockies. And so, it's obviously getting very close to our border, and our risk has increased significantly because of that. So what's going on in Montana right now is they had their first detection in 2017 in the state, sort of just south of the endemic areas in Alberta and Saskatchewan. So that wasn't a big surprise. But then in 2019, it turned up in Libby, Montana, in the northwest part of Montana there. And so their surveillance and response effort there has turned up with 109 positive cases, mainly in white-tailed deer. They had, I think, a couple mule deer and one moose, but most of those have been white-tailed deer. I guess the good news, sort of, is that the cases really seem to be clustered around the Libby area. So on this map, the red dots are the positive cases, but then you'll see between Libby and the BC border, there's a lot of beige circles. And those are hunter samples that have been submitted and came back negative. So that's a good sign. However, you know, the prevalence of the disease in that population, mainly urban population around Libby, you know, it is very concerning. It's not going away, but at least we haven't detected it between Libby and BC yet. The Alberta situation is a little bit more concerning for BC. That it continues to spread west, now right into the foothills. On the eastern edge of Cwd, like along the eastern edge of Alberta, along the Alberta-Saskatchewan border, is where the disease has been present the longest. So the first detection along the border in 2005. So it's been, you know, over 15 years, but now they're actually reporting 50% of the male mule deer that are tested in those areas are coming back positive, which is a very high prevalence, you know, and a big change over the course of just 15 years. On the western edge, all of the red stars on this map indicate first detection in those wildlife units last year. And so, as you can see, all of a sudden, basically, you know, there's a leading edge on that western side on its way to BC. And so we're quite concerned about that. Those detections included cases in both mule deer and white-tailed deer. In Alberta, it's mainly been this disease has mainly been detected in adult male mule deer, but they're starting to see it in both species, and that's what we're seeing on the western edge as well. So Alberta has been excellent in their surveillance over the last 15 plus years, and they have been generating a huge amount of information that's been really valuable, and we're working really closely with them. But they did scale back their testing in 2020 so that there's fewer units now that are mandatory for submission. So although there's still mandatory along that western edge, which will be really important information for BC, there's a whole area in sort of the central part of this endemic area where it's no longer mandatory to submit heads for testing, and so that's information now that we're not getting, and where that really impacts us is with BC hunters that are going to Alberta and harvesting animals and bringing parts of those animals back and not knowing whether or not they're positive or not. So the main concerns for us is that I mentioned that the BC hunters coming back with sometimes intact carcasses, which we do, you know, have a regulation in place that prohibits the import of intact carcasses to try and reduce the risk of bringing Cwd back. But we know what happens, and it happens a lot. And so that risk is very concerning. These cases are also now well within the range of natural animal movement. So there's nothing stopping these animals from, you know, moving in between BC and Alberta. And so that is quite concerning. The increase in prevalence is also related to an increase in environmental contamination. So with more infected animals on the landscape, the prions, concentrations of prions are accumulating in the environment and contaminating the environment and plants in the environment, and that includes hay. And a lot of, you know, as you can imagine, southern Alberta, there's a lot of hay production there. And so that material that gets moved around all over is potentially contaminated with these prions that could move it and introduce it to new places. There's also been an increase in the number of farms, like cervid farms in Alberta, that have tested positive. There have all, you know, since its introduction to Alberta, there have been farms affected, but in the last couple of years, there's really been an uptick in the number of farms that are affected every year. And because they have really strict rules and restrictions on the movement of animals to try and manage this disease. You know, there's a hypothesis maybe that through process of elimination that maybe new farms are being affected because of movement of hay. But we still don't have any way to test those materials, to test environmental samples or hay. And so right now it's just a theory. So at home here in BC, the current situation, thankfully, is that we've not yet detected Cwd in the province, but the risk level obviously has increased dramatically in the last few years. So prevention is our top priority, and we focus on that by increasing awareness of the program, of the risks, of what we're doing. We are trying to reduce those risks, and we have an objective to detect the disease as soon as possible if it is introduced to BC. So we have a plan, the surveillance and response plan for Cwd in BC, which focuses on prevention, surveillance, and response planning. And we are very lucky in that, you know, we're not having to write the book on this. There are a lot of experts out there, a lot of places that have had to deal with this, and we've learned a lot over the last couple of decades through their experience. And there's a really amazing network of cross-jurisdictional partners that are working together to share all this information and support each other. So we're looking at, you know, all these places to learn as much as we can. We're looking really closely at Manitoba and Idaho and Montana, who are responding to the new detections in real time, and we're trying to learn from that. So some of the risks for BC are based on the proximity of cases. So that's really for us now is southern Alberta and northwestern Montana, because we're in that range of natural animal movement. There's also the potential to import. So that's importing an infected carcass, importing contaminated materials like hay, and because the humans have the ability to transport these materials long distances, human import of a chronic wasting disease material or these prions really could be transported to anywhere in BC, and it could pop up in an area where we're not doing a lot of surveillance and be left unchecked, which is really concerning. And the last real risk is what we call high-risk situations. These are situations where you would have an increase in disease transmission rates, where there might be an attractants or something drawing animals in and seeing unnatural aggregation of animals where we see increased disease transmission rates. Another high risk situation would be like a high density situation, high density population. So the specific sources that could bring Cwd into BC, infected live animals obviously is probably the most significant vector for this disease and how it's been spreading around North America. But infected carcasses are also a possible vector. Contaminated material, things like hay or biological scents, urine-based scents that hunters use can contain Cwd prions potentially, and so that could be a vector for bringing it into the disease. And lastly, scavengers. We don't really know too much about this, but there have been some studies that have showed coyotes and crows specifically have the ability to scavenge an infected animal, consume part of that animal. They're not affected by the disease. The disease isn't transferred to the scavenger, but the prion material can travel through the digestive tract and come out the other end completely infectious. So the scavenger just has an ability to move these prions on the landscape. So reducing these risks, we focus on increasing awareness of these risks, particularly risky sort of human behavior and activities. We've implemented some regulations and some recommendations, really detecting it as soon as possible at the lowest possible prevalence. So like the fewest number of animals that are affected is your best chance of containing the disease, catching it early before it establishes. So we do that through surveillance, and then response planning. Response planning is really important so that when we do get that detection, everyone is up to speed. We have a great collaborative group that we work with on this, and we can hit the ground running for a rapid and coordinated response. So increasing awareness, we focus on these risky sort of human activities, and we do this through outreach. We have different resources that we've produced that are available on the website. We call it the top graphic there is a fact card. We have a series of fact cards that we developed for social media. We don't have our own social media, but we encourage our partners to post this information. We have a number of posters as well that target some of these risky activities and encouraging people to limit them. So some focus is on the import of the contaminated materials that we talked about, also handling and disposal of high-risk material. So if carcasses are coming into the province, or parts of an animal are coming into the province, making sure that people understand how to handle and dispose of them properly. And then things like the risk associated with bringing animals in unnatural aggregation, things like attractants, baiting, and feeding of cervids increases the risk and potential for disease transmission. So just educating people around those types of things. So we have a number of regulations in place in BC. I'm going to focus on these two. We have a ban on native cervid farming. We don't farm native cervids in BC. There's a very small number of reindeer and fallow deer farms, but nothing like the large-scale operations that you see in the prairies. We also have a ban on importing of live cervids. So these other two, the Carcass Import and the cervid-based scents regulation, just want to talk a little bit about. So the Carcass Import regulation, again, the intention here is to limit high-risk material coming into the province and potentially introducing the disease here. The regulation is outlined in the synopsis on page 20 under possession and transportation. We're targeting, the current regulation is targeting high-risk tissues, which are defined on the left there. So things like the head, the hide, spinal column, internal organs, mammary glands, anything like the central nervous system tissue, organs are going to have a higher concentration of prions, but really any tissue in the body, including bones or hide, they can all include prions. And so we want to limit that material coming into BC. We do know that this still happens, and it happens often, and it's usually because hunters are not aware. In the last couple of weeks, I've had multiple conversations with hunters that have returned to BC with high-risk tissues or intact carcasses or cervid heads, and they are just not aware of the risks or this regulation. And of course, nobody wants to bring Cwd to BC, and so in general, they're really cooperative, and if they have tissues, then we can get them tested. But increasing awareness of this risk is really, really important. And then understanding if even if you just brought the permitted parts back to BC, but you process your quartered animal when you get back, and you have a bunch of bone and waste material, to make sure that is disposed of properly, because that could include have prions in that tissue. And so making sure that that's going to a landfill rather than the forest in your backyard where it can get into the environment. basically right now the current risk is too high, and so we're going to propose tightening up this regulation. The serve-at-scent regulation is another one. Again, we know that prions can be present in bodily fluids like urine and blood, but we still don't have the ability to test this type of material. The tests don't exist for that type of material yet. There's some companies now that are saying, oh, that they are Cwd certified, and for sure there's been advancements in the testing, that they do have some amplification techniques that are in a lab setting able to test things like urine and blood, but we're not aware of any real practical way of doing this, and so we still are erring on the side of caution, and that we can't be certain that these products are free of prions, and so we prohibit the use in BC. However, the use is actually really difficult to enforce, and we know that these products are still sold in BC. So pulling those two regulations together, we're proposing a regulation change to combine the two and expand on the prohibited parts. So what we're proposing is to prohibit the possession of all served parts originating from outside of BC, and this would include biological scents, but there would be an exception on deboned meat and cleaned hide, antlers, and skull plate with all the tissue removed. So again, the intention here is to limit the amount of potentially contaminated material, Cwd infected material entering the environment. We want to reduce that risk as much as possible. But we appreciate that this has an impact on hunters, and particularly vendors of these products. And so at this point, this regulation change is just a proposal, and we'd really like to hear and receive feedback to see, if this is something that is supported. We're proposing that it would become effective for the 2022 season. And so, please let us know what you think. Again, the intention is to reduce the risk as much as possible, but we understand that there are impacts. So we would like to have a discussion about it to make sure that it works for everyone. So in addition to the regulations, we also develop recommendations. So we have some best management practices around proper handling and disposal of high-risk material. Cwd positive meat, and I learned of a case just today where a BC hunter just found out that his mule deer that he harvested in Alberta tested positive. The meat is all in his freezer, but we ask that they turn it over to us so that we can dispose of it properly. And when we have confirmed Cwd positive material, the best thing to do is to have it incinerated and then buried at a landfill. Another a risk that we're trying to address through outreach is the risk of importing hay or feed. And we are, working with Cattlemen's Association and ranchers and our range program within government to just educate folks on this risk and encourage, when possible, to source things like hay from areas that are not impacted with Cwd, if that's an option. And I know that this is really tricky, and with all the wildfires we've had in BC, we're really in a crisis mode, and we need that material and that feed for the animals. But if there's ever opportunities to source from areas outside of the Cwd endemic zone, then that will help to reduce the risk of bringing it to BC. And then again, talking about these hotspots for disease transmission, just educating folks on different activities that can bring animals into unnaturally high concentrations, things like attractants, feeding and baiting, and even urban deer populations. These all can contribute to increased rates of disease transmission, and not just Cwd, but there's other health concerns related to these types of behaviors. So these are recommendations, and I'm sure you're aware there's with the feeding and baiting of ungulates is actually a relatively new regulation in Region 4, but that's just applied to Region 4. For the rest of the province right now, it's just a recommendation. Okay, so Cwd Surveillance, so this is our testing program. We have a province-wide testing program on all cervid species over 1 year of age. We can only test animals over 1 year of age right now because of basically the sensitivity of the test. Anything under a year of age is likely to be a false negative because those prions haven't had a chance to accumulate. So any cervid rather over 1 year of age is tested. We target our surveillance in the highest risk areas. We have limited resources, and so we need to focus our resources in the most effective way. So really focusing on those high risk areas. And we are working really closely with our counterparts in other jurisdictions, Alberta and Montana especially, also Idaho and Saskatchewan and Manitoba. We're all connected and sharing information. Also working with some research collaborators to look at animal movement and connectivity of habitat so that we can use all of this information to try and predict points of entry through natural animal movement and based on these proximity of cases and where these animals are moving through, so that we can really focus our surveillance efforts in those highest risk spots. Our surveillance objectives are to confirm and report Cwd status, to detect it as early as possible, and to collect that really important information that's going to inform our response to a Cwd detection. So we encourage hunters from anywhere in the province to submit ahead for testing. So that's deer, elk, moose, or caribou over 1 year of age. It's voluntary in most areas, mandatory in the high risk areas, and we'll go over those details in a minute. Encourage hunters to remove the antlers. We don't want the antlers. There's a few different ways to do that. You can remove the antlers at the base of the skull or the skull plate. Sorry, yeah, right at the base of the antler, or both antlers with the skull plate. Or if you're interested in doing a European mount, you can just submit the low jaw. This works for deer only, because on elk and moose and caribou, we need part of the brainstem. But we've had lots of hunters just submitting the low jaw, and we're able to get excellent samples from them, so it's working really well. So further details about all of this, the instructions, our various freezer locations around the province, and where you can access results are all on the website. What we're actually collecting from these animals, so the samples, are in deer, we collect lymph nodes and tonsils, and in elk, moose, and caribou, we collect lymph nodes and the brainstem. So we're targeting a really specific lymph node. There's multiple lymph nodes throughout the body and even multiple in the head, but we target a specific lymph node at the back of the throat. And that's why we ask that if you're submitting a head for testing, you include a little bit of the neck, because if it's cut too close to the jawline, sometimes those lymph nodes can be aren't included. But as you can see with the Euro mount, we're asking hunters to just submit the low jaw, and as long as the back of that lower jaw bone, where it kind of crests upward, as long as that is intact, it tends to protect the tissues just in behind that, and that's where we're going for. If anyone is interested in learning about collecting samples, we do have some hunters that have reached out that they would like to learn how to collect their own samples. Some are doing it and submitting the extracted tissues already to the program, and it's working really well. There's a lot of instructional videos online just by Googling it, or you can reach out to us directly, and we're happy to coordinate some training. Yeah, let me know if anyone's interested in doing that. So here are our surveillance totals from last year. So we had 1,185 samples tested, all came back negative. 87% of samples came from hunters. So you can see right there why hunters are so important to this program. Again, most of the samples are coming out of the highest risk areas, and based on the proximity of cases and other risk factors, we've had to target our resources in those areas, and we've really tried to enhance surveillance in those areas. So right now that includes the Kootenay and Peace regions. And so obviously most of the samples are coming out of the Kootenay region right now. These are meeting our targets, which is great. The results, we can't really confirm the absence of the disease, that it's not here, but the more samples that we get, the better confidence, or what we call detection limits, we can achieve. So the more samples we get, the better our confidence is in a CWD-free status. But if, as you can see, some areas, even in the Kootenay region, or certainly in other parts of BC, are vulnerable because we're not doing a lot of surveillance. And I mean, we couldn't do that level of surveillance that we're doing in the Kootenays right across the province because we just don't have the capacity. But it is concerning that some of these areas, we have very few samples and very few information on the health status of those populations. And so if CWD material like a carcass was imported, it really could turn up anywhere. And so we do want to expand, but we have to do it in a smart way, that's cost effective, and we need partnership to do that. So I'm sure you're aware of the new hunting license condition that was issued this year. So this is for mandatory submission for testing, CWD testing in the highest risk areas. This is consistent with what we had in place for the last 2 years under the Animal Health Act General Order, but now it's under the General Hunting License condition. It targets the highest risk area. So right now, that's management units 4.1 through 4.7 and 4.23. We reevaluate this, or we're going to reevaluate this every year, and based on cases in neighboring jurisdictions and other risk factors, that high risk area could shift or expand. But for this year, this is the mandatory zone, and that applies to all resident and non-resident hunters, and for both deer species. It's not mandatory for elk or moose at this point, but both mule deer and white-tailed deer in these areas. So just kind of to summarize, some of the challenges of CWD and that we've faced with this program is that CWD is it's inherently hard to detect. And I talked a little bit about how in early introductions of this disease, there's a very few number of animals that are infected. And so you need to test many animals to have, well, for one, to be able to even detect the disease or have confidence. And so what we are trying to do is access as many animals as possible that are already being removed from the landscape. We don't want to have to go out and have like government-led sampling. And so that's why we focus on hunter samples and roadkill samples, so that these are animals that are already being removed from the landscape. And if we can access as many of those as possible, then that gives us good confidence in our surveillance data. It's still really difficult for us to access these samples, especially roadkill, which are a really important sample for us because, if an animal is infected with this disease, even before a human can kind of see that the symptoms showing, they're going to have some vulnerability and they're going to be more susceptible to being hit by a car. So these roadkill samples are really important. We're working with trappers around the province that collect roadkill for bait, and they've been wonderful, but we're still having, it's still been tricky to access enough of those. And again, limited resources, of course. So there's a small group of us out of Nanaimo that are leading this effort, and we have to travel around the province to do the sampling, and it's it's pretty time consuming, and with all the challenges with travel right now and everything, it's been tricky. So we've had to prioritize in the highest risk areas, and that's why most of the sampling is being executed in the Kootenay region. But the successes, we've had amazing support right across the board, from communities, from hunters, from conservation groups and our partners in NGOs. It's been overwhelming. It's been super positive, and we're really grateful for that. We've had a number of clubs and different businesses volunteer their time. They donate and host freezers. We were able to access funding through the Together for Wildlife strategy. Before last year, this CWD program in BC did not have a budget. We didn't have a dedicated budget until we were able to access Together for Wildlife funding. And so last year and this year, we actually have a dedicated budget to the program. So that's been a success. And that's enabled us to hire 2 regional CWD coordinators, one in the Peace and one in the Kootenay region. So these are locals from these communities that work with us on a part-time basis, but they really help with the on-the-ground operations and outreach and connecting us with the local contacts. So we have been able to achieve good detection limits in that mandatory zone of the Kootenays, which is good because that is our high-risk area. And probably most importantly, I think, in terms of successes of this program, is an incredible collaborative team that we've built over the last number of years. We have an advisory committee, a provincial advisory committee, and we have regional working groups, one in the Peace and one in the Kootenays. And these include stakeholders, First Nations partners, local businesses, regional staff from our wildlife, conservation officers, agriculture, just really across the board, other agency partners. And it's really an incredible collaborative team. Everyone comes to the table, everyone brings their expertise, their experience, their input. And so, that really helps to guide our program. And I think what has made it so successful. So onto the tricky stuff. So what is our response going to look like if CWD is detected in BC? And I should say when CWD is detected in BC. I would say it's inevitable at this point. We've been really lucky so far, but it's coming and we want to be prepared for it. So the appropriate response to a CWD detection is going to look different depending on the situation, depending on where it's detected, in what species, the time of year, like what are the circumstances around it. But in any case, our response is going to be informed by what we've learned through surveillance. It's going to be guided by this collaborative team with our advisory committee and our regional working groups and all of our partners. And that includes CWD experts from other jurisdictions. So the Alberta CWD program lead, as well as the Montana CWD program lead, they both sit on that advisory committee. We have other CWD experts from other places. We have academic advisors. It's really going to be a team effort. It's going to have to be. We've run some tabletop exercises. There's some practice runs this year to run through some scenarios and what it's all going to look like to make sure that we're going to have a really rapid and coordinated response when it happens. And thankfully, we're not having to reinvent the wheel. There are excellent recommendations and guidance documents that have been developed by experts that will guide this response. And these experts will support us and they will be at the table and they will help us in this process. So we have, again, the surveillance and response plan that we can follow. The response outlined in this plan that's available on the website, so you can have a look at it. It really just addresses the initial response immediately following a detection. So we can run through those steps in general. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about some of these guidance documents that have been developed by the experts. One of the most important references or resources out there is this technical report that was developed by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies on best management practices for prevention, surveillance, and management of Cwd. This is a quote from that report. Once Cwd has been established in a population, often well before it's detected, its eradication is not currently considered feasible. However, opportunities remain for responsible management agencies to stabilize or suppress Cwd outbreaks and thereby minimize impacts and potential irreparable harm. Essentially, that means we have an opportunity, once it's detected, to limit the transmission, keep the prevalence or the number of animals affected to a minimum, and limit or prevent spread to new areas. So that would be the focus. And I've underlined established here because, yes, in many cases when Cwd is first detected in a jurisdiction, it's not a new introduction. It's been there for a while and it's been left undetected. But what we're trying to do in areas like the Kootenay region is to get ahead of that. We're doing enhanced surveillance in those areas to try and get it before it establishes. And so that's another effort that we're working on to try and stay ahead of it. So there might be an opportunity to eradicate if we catch it early enough. Here's another really important resource. It's recommendations for adaptive management of Cwd in the West. This was developed by WAFWA, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. And this is a quote from that. Most attempts to manage Cwd have focused on reducing population density and eliminating areas of Cwd outbreak through hunter harvest and agency culling. Many of these programs were terminated due to the lack of measurable success, high costs, and lack of public support. Management strategies need to include realistic objectives applied over extended periods of time with sustained public and political support and the ability to evaluate efficacy. So our response in BC is basically going to have two phases. There's the initial response phase. So this is the emergency actions that are taken immediately after a detection. And these actions are outlined in our surveillance and response plan. So this phase will focus on determining the scope. So the species affected, the distribution, the prevalence around a small area surrounding that initial detection, and that will inform any further action. Immediately, we're gonna try and reduce transmission and spread by implementing some restrictions or other emergency restrictions or requirements. Ultimately, the goal is to eradicate. And if we can catch it early enough, that's a possibility. Otherwise, if it's established, then we're going to focus on containing it and not letting it spread to other areas. The longer-term Cwd management is not addressed in our plan. This is something that we are starting to develop. We're starting discussions around this. We're looking at other examples of Cwd management plans. But really, you can't really develop a management plan until you have a situation to build it around. And so we're pulling all the information together so that we have those tools at the ready. And those are going to really focus on realistic objectives and strategies for the situation that's presented, and set up in a way that it's adaptive and tailored to that specific population or area of the province. It's really important that this management actions or Cwd management is applied in a systematic and hypothesis-based way so that we can evaluate and adapt as we go. So for the initial response, here are some of the actions that are outlined in our plan, and they're consistent with what have been done in other places. So the image on the left is the Cwd management zone that was defined in Libby, Montana. So once a case is detected, there would be an initial response area defined, which would be approximately a 10-kilometer radius or something similar to one of our wildlife management units. So then any emergency actions, whether it's regulations, restrictions, targeted sampling would all be applied within that initial response area. So think of a management unit. Preventing the spread and transmission is something that we can do right off the bat, no matter where it's detected. So this would likely include something like carcass transport restrictions or some disposal requirements. So if animals are harvested or roadkill animals, for instance, any kind of cervid that dies in this initial response area, we're gonna want to reduce the transport of those animals and make sure that they get to a proper disposal site so that we don't risk moving the disease around any further. We might also do some targeted removals if a high risk or hotspot situation is identified. So if we find a cluster of cases around a particular attractant, if it was a cluster of cases in an urban deer population, for example, it would have to be really specific and defined as a high risk situation for us to go in and remove those animals. In terms of determining the prevalence and distribution of the disease and that situation, we're going to want to do some targeted sampling. Within an initial response area or a management unit, in general, we would need somewhere in the neighborhood of 150 samples to get a good understanding of the situation, see if there's additional positives, what species are affected, and that sort of information. Now, if we already have that information through our surveillance effort, through hunter samples that were submitted in that year from that management unit, then we're already going to have that information. We can hit the ground running, and we may not even have to go ahead and do any additional sampling. So over to Cwd management, and again, the examples that I have here are really coming out of these two resources, the WAFWA recommendations and the AFWA technical report. But here's some guidance, I guess, from these documents on how to approach Cwd management on the longer term. Ultimately, we're wanting to limit prevalence, limit transmission, and limit spread. So they recommend utilizing existing management activities, and the main one is harvest, and using harvest to help to target and remove those animals that are most likely to be infected. So depending on the situation, if we look to like Eastern Alberta, where it was mainly adult male mule deer affected, then that might be where the harvest is targeting. It's also really important to target areas with increased transmission rates. Again, if there's a cluster of cases near agricultural area, something like that, and other disease focal points or hotspots. We would really also very important in this is the timing. So there's certain times of the year based on different studies that show that there's increased transmission rates at certain times. And so you want to focus the harvest at those times to remove any the animals that are most likely to be infected. Limiting attractants and different situations where animals are aggregating, again, is going to reduce the potential for increased disease transmission. And carrying on with the carcass transport restrictions and disposal requirements on the long term, just to limit the chance of moving infected carcasses around and introducing the disease to new areas. So in conclusion, this is really what I'm hoping that you will take away from this presentation and this information, is that Cwd is very scary, and it's going to be challenging no matter how we do it. It's a very complicated issue. There's going to be conflicting opinions on how we do it, and that's why it's really important that we approach it as a team, that we all have the right information. They're aware of the different tools that are available, but it's going to be tricky. But I hope that you also see that we have a really incredible opportunity right now to be proactive. BC is still Cwd free, and we have an opportunity to be proactive, to get ahead of it, to work together, to tighten up our preventative measures, to increase surveillance, to get the information we need, and to really prepare for that first detection so that we can be as effective as possible in responding to it. I hope that you recognize the importance of your role as a hunter or in whatever capacity. I hope that you can see that you have a role to play here, and that, you know, we do really need your help. I hope that this information has empowered you and that you're motivated to continue to be an exceptional advocate for wildlife, and particularly an advocate for this effort to protect wildlife in BC from chronic wasting disease. So I encourage you to share this information, find the resources, share them, post them on social media if you have the ability to do that. If you have an ability to sponsor a workshop or a webinar, again, so thankful for the invitation tonight to be able to share this information. If you have the ability to host a freezer or sponsor a shelter of one of our freezers, it's great for advertising, but it also really helps us out in building our capacity for surveillance and making it as convenient as possible for hunters to participate and submit ahead. And of course, if you're hunters and you're successful, please consider submitting your head for testing. So again, it's a very busy slide because there's a lot of incredible people across the province that are helping us out. We have a huge team and everyone is doing an exceptional job. And so I just wanted to acknowledge all the people that are out there helping us out. And on the right here, I've included some of the references and resources that I mentioned in the talk, including our website address, the OFWA and WAFWA documents, and that report that addresses the human health and has that summary of human health information. So with that, thank you so much. I hope that there's some questions, but if you have questions following this, my contact information is there. Please, at any time, feel free to give me a call or email. I always love to hear from anyone who has feedback or questions or anything. The success of our program is really, it's so important to have the feedback from hunters and from the communities to help us to continue to improve and be successful. So thank you so much.
Kate, wow. I mean, I have a whole page of questions, and as you probably knew I would, but I am going to roll through with some of our participants first. And so, folks, if you have posted a question in the chat or the Q&A, what I'm going to do now is promote you to panelist. Dan, you're the first one that I'm trying to figure out how to do that. And so, Dan, if you can turn on your video and or at least your audio, you should be promoted to panelist now, I think. There you are.
Hi, Dan. Dan.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now.
There you go. So you got my question, yeah?
You go ahead and repeat it, please, Dan.
Oh, I'm wondering if the prions continue to exist on knives or saws or any sort of tools that you use to butcher an infected animal.
It can. There was a recent publication actually that showed that a 40% bleach solution, I think it was for 20 minutes on metal tools, will help to deactivate and clean up any of your tools. So that's the recommendation, is a 40% bleach solution. I believe that's will be effective on metal tools. It doesn't have the same efficacy on like surfaces, like, you know, a wooden cutting board or different things like that. But for metal tools, it seems to be effective.
There you go. It's the answer I'm looking for.
Amberly, you're muted.
I know. Danielle, I have you promoted to panelist if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, yeah. So I just want to know how exactly you would go about submitting your own specimens. Like I work in histology, and like, do you need to have any sort of fixative? Is there any special things you need to do?
Well, that's great. So what we generally do for hunters is we just get them to extract the tissues, leave them intact, and submit them frozen in a World Pack. And then once we receive them, then we process them. And what we do is we split the tissue in half. We put half in a fixative formalin, and that's what is submitted to the lab in Saskatchewan. And then we retain half of the tissue frozen in BC as a backup sample in case we ever have an inconclusive, then we can resubmit. So Danielle, since you're familiar with fixatives, I think we could probably arrange that. But in general, we ask that hunters just submit the tissues frozen, and then we process them once we receive them.
Okay, good to know. Hopefully I'm in an area that doesn't have it, so hopefully I never need to do it, but good to know.
Thank you.
Muted again. Elise, I have you up next for a question.
Yeah, great webinar, guys. Really, really good stuff. Thanks so much. And I just want to reiterate what I said in the chat, that's totally supportive of all the necessary regulations that you think are necessary. Curious to know, however, what sort of support you would be helpful from the hunter community, because I think we all know that this comes down to political support. How can we help?
Thank you. Thank you so much for your support. That's great. I think the process goes, I mean, so far we've presented this proposed regulation. It's based on recommendations from the science community and the Cwd experts. We've presented it to our FTAT, the Hunting and Trapping Advisory Team, and they're supportive of it. And I think the next stage is we'll likely post something on the public engagement for comment, and then we'll just see what we receive from public comments through that avenue. But yeah, I think just helping to increase awareness and communicate the intention of the regulation to hunters is really important. So that would always, increasing awareness is always really helpful for us. That communication piece is, you wouldn't think it was that hard, but we really struggle reaching people with information. And I still talk to so many hunters that aren't aware of these risks, and they're always so happy to receive that information, but it's sometimes tricky to know how to reach them effectively. So any way you can help with that.
Are you using things like Silvercore or any of the other retailers, both training and hunter supplier retailers for that conveyance of that information, Kate?
Yeah, we try. We definitely have some of the like sporting goods stores have been great partners in communicating that. In communicating information. Whenever we do a road trip, we always put up posters, and we have rack cards that we're at a lot of the Canadian Tires or places like that around the province. So we try and distribute the printed material, but we also have some partners in sporting goods stores like Backcountry up in Fort St. John. They promote the program. They donate different goods to our raffle. They post stuff on, they work with the rod and gun clubs up there and post stuff on their social media platforms. And so, there's examples of that as well. But again, there's so many out there that we haven't been able to connect with just because we don't have that capacity to be everywhere, but
Right.
But for sure.
Great work. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Robin.
Hi, Robin, you're muted.
Beginner on his laptop. I can say that because I'm his sister. Robin, we're going to skip you for a minute. You can sort out your.
back.
Oh, there you are.
I hear you now.
Sorry, I got it on mute in case the dogs have an explosion. Yeah, way to go on such a long talk. And the percentage of infected cases in some of the really hot areas, is it 30% or can it be much higher?
Well, yeah, I think in some of the areas where the disease has been present the longest, they're seeing prevalence or percentage of, towards 50% in some of these areas that have had it the longest. Certainly like in, places like Colorado, Wyoming, those places where it was first detected, they're seeing prevalence like at that level. The statistic that I quoted from Alberta, that was 50%, but that's just of male mule deer. So that's not across all of the animals that they're testing, but if you just focused in on adult male mule deer, it's 50% already in the eastern portion of Alberta. So that's pretty high, even for that sort of subpopulation of male mule deer.
That is high. Thank you, Kate.
Mm-hmm.
Nathan.
Hi, great talk. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. My question is just a little more logistical. Just wondering how long it takes to get your results back once you've sent a head in for testing.
That's tricky. That's something that we're really struggling with because I wish I could say a week, but so first of all, it depends on where you're submitting a sample from, I guess, because we're really focusing our energy in the Kootenays right now. We're trying to get, and just the volume of samples that are coming in, we're trying to sample there once a month. Again, our crew from Nanaimo has to travel out to the Kootenay region to do this sampling. And, we were trying to plan a trip pretty quick here, but of course, with all the road closures in BC, there's complications to that. In any case, if you're submitting a sample in the Kootenay region, we're collecting and submitting samples once a month, and then it takes about 3 weeks after they're submitted to the lab. So right there, you're looking at anywhere from 4 to 7 weeks for a turnaround time. It's not great. If you're submitting a sample from somewhere else in the province where we're not doing sampling as regularly, it might be even longer. But what we're trying to do, and actually we're rethinking our whole approach to this for next year and trying to get someone on the ground locally that is there to sample heads as they come in and get them to the lab as soon as possible. So hopefully we'll be able to make some improvements in that as soon as next year. But the other thing that we'd really like to do is develop testing in BC. And that's another big problem right now, is we're having to send all of our samples to the University of Saskatchewan because we don't have capacity in BC to test for this disease. And so, Saskatchewan's been great to us, but basically we submit samples in batches and we get in the queue because they're testing all of the Saskatchewan samples as well. If we could develop capacity to test in BC, I think we get that turnaround a lot smaller time frame. And but again, it's a matter of, it's a big investment to get that equipment here. We're partnering with our Ministry of Agriculture, and they're keen to take this on and to be our diagnostic lab for the program. But it's gonna take some dollars for sure for that investment. So that might be a little bit further down the road. We're trying to come up with ideas to get that sooner. Long-winded question. Basically, you're looking at 4 to 8 weeks likely for a result.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dave.
Hi, Kate.
Hi, Dave.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I'm an avid hunter in the East Kootenays, 403 in particular. right on the Montana-Idaho borders.
Mhm.
And we've been submitting our heads for the last 3 years.
Thank you.
And we take them into the chapters there. But anyways, what I do know for a fact is that a lot of local people are not submitting their heads. Secondly, there is a lot of people, I'm from the Lower Mainland, by the way, but I kind of raised in the Kootenays days, so I go back there every year for an annual hunt for the last 40-something years.
Mhm.
And what we've noticed up there is there are people down in my area that are returning. They're either, when I bring it up with them, they pretend they don't know about it and stuff like that there. But on, I have a little butcher shop here. We kind of take care of our own things down here at the coast. On behalf of SCI, I wanted to sponsor a freezer and a shelter as well.
Wow.
Here, and I think that would be a good backup plan for people that do get down the mainland. You know, sometimes hunters leave it late at night. They don't feel like dropping their heads off, or for whatever reason they have. I think we can put something together down here and put that out as a backup program for the people that do manage to leave the Kootenays without properly submitting their heads. And on behalf of all of us, I'd like to be able to offer to do that.
Thank you. That's incredible. And you know what? The Lower Mainland area is there's a real need for that. I talked to a lot of hunters that are from the Lower Mainland that are hunting in the Kootenays, and
Exactly.
they call me when they come. They know about it, but they, for whatever reason, didn't drop the head off until they were back on the coast. And we don't have freezers set up on the coast, so that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think we can. We'll work towards that here probably pretty much right away.
Thank you
Okay,
so
after this
much.
webinar. You betcha.
Thank you so much. If you want to follow up with me, send me an email or give me a call in the next couple of days. However, I can help with logistics or planning that, setting it up. That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Okay,
Looking
thank
forward to it.
you.
Okay,
Great.
you bet.
Dropping the heads off here.
So I'm going to take the floor for a bit because I wrote up a list of questions. Kate, my question, one of my first questions was, we don't really see them in the late stage of the disease. And so we see healthy animals. How long does that late stage last? Like what, from the time they start to experience weakness until time of death? And you probably have that information from a farmed setting more than a wild setting.
Yeah, research settings have definitely documented that. And there is some variability depending on the species, and there's different strains of Cwd that have like different symptomatic periods. But in general, if an animal is infected, it's between 18 months, sometimes as much as 24 months, I think, before they can develop symptoms. And then that symptomatic period or the clinical stage at the end is usually very quick, like just a couple of weeks, and then the animal dies. So the course of this disease, once an animal is infected, they've usually died from the disease within 2.5 years. And so that symptomatic stage is very short at the end.
Are they shedding the virus right from the time, or the prion right from the time they've contracted it? Like, does the prion actually multiply in the body? So, when we have a cold or a flu, we've got kind of a window before we become actively shedding.
Mm-hmm.
What they happens? Shed it right away?
What happens with these prions is once this abnormal protein is introduced to the body, it actually has the ability. So all of us, like all animals, have normal prions in our bodies. It just is it's a type of a protein. So we all have them, but it's this abnormal protein called the prion, this disease-causing prion. Once it's introduced to the body, it actually has the ability to convert normal prions to Cwd prions, if that makes sense. So they come into contact with normal proteins, and they cause them, we don't fully understand how it happens, but they cause them to misfold and become these disease-causing proteins or prions. And so in the early stages, it's believed that the concentration of prions, like they haven't had the opportunity to accumulate. So they're going to be in a lower concentration in earlier stages of the disease, whereas in a late stage of the disease, there's a high concentration of prions, so the animal's going to be shedding a lot more towards the end. We don't fully understand at what point after infection they start to shed the prions, but it is believed that throughout the course of the disease they are shedding them. As those prions accumulate in the body, there is the ability to shed them. They're just going to be at a lower concentration at the beginning of the infection versus the end.
I had forgotten that. I think when we met with you before that you had described how they were kind of recruiting other proteins in the body. So that's pretty interesting, isn't it? And just remind me again, we have no evidence of transmission to livestock.
That's right. Yeah, no evidence. There's been various studies that have looked at transmission to different species outside of the cervid family, and it has, under research conditions, so not natural conditions, it has been transmitted to other species. But there seems to be a fairly strong species barrier with cattle, for example. And even in the research setting, there seems to be a really strong barrier to disease, to transmission of Cwd to a cattle for whatever reason. So in a natural setting, there's never been a case outside of cervid species. But there has been some research to try and better understand the potential for transmission to other species. I referenced those non-human primate studies, and there's other species as well. But these are, again, under research conditions. We haven't seen it in nature.
That's good to know. So First Nations in BC are, what level of participation and involvement are we seeing from that end of harvesting of animals in the province?
We've got some great First Nations partners around the province, particularly in the Peace region and in the Kootenay region. In the Peace region, we work really closely with the Aboriginal Liaison Program and a number of Treaty 8 nations that have been super supportive, and they turn in samples. Likewise with Tanaha in the Kootenay region, they've hosted workshops and training sessions. They're on our regional working group. We have some other partners around the province, including Statliam First Nation, that has run a mule deer health program in the Statliam communities, and they've submitted heads for testing. And the Okanagan Nation Alliance actually just set up a new Cwd program this fall, so that one's just getting off the ground, and so we're working with that organization as well. So great partnerships with First Nations, and hoping to expand that as well, because there's tons of interest, and I think a real need for enhancing our outreach and communications across the board, but particularly with Indigenous audiences. So yeah.
So on the herds that are bordering us, that are close, like Alberta and Montana, do they have an idea of what percentage of those herds are infected? Like, 2%, 10%, any ballpark idea of those ones, or not yet?
Well, what I do know is, based on the surveillance data from Alberta last year, it was a very small percentage of the samples submitted on that western edge came back positive. So it's still a low prevalence is what we'd say on that western edge. Considering its mandatory submission, they received like hundreds of samples from those units, and only a handful of positive cases. Still very concerning, because it's there, and it's arrived to these regions through natural animal movement. It's not like it jumped. It's there's a wave moving across Alberta, so we know it's coming. But still, it's a small number of animals on the western edge compared to the the eastern side of Alberta, where it's been established much longer.
So then my last question is well, it might not be my last question, but when you talked about if we detect it really early, then there's that potential for eradication. What is that measuring stick for that early detection?
Yeah, it's optimistic. I'm optimistic. I mean, of course, that's our goal, is we
Yeah.
want to detect it as early as possible. We want to detect the first animal so that we can remove it and, you know, and take care of that situation. The reality is, if all the experiences that we've seen across North America and in other places, eradication has not been successful. The only exception is New York State. They had some cases in a farm, and it spilled over to the wild population. I think they detected it in one wild deer, and they just approached it so fast. It was like $1 million response effort over the, like, you know, few weeks, and they managed, we think, to eradicate it from that area, because they haven't had any further detections for several years now. But that's the only example. And I think, yeah, so it's gonna be tricky. I mean, we would definitely have to find it early. And because we have this situation of, even if we did eradicate it, we still have this wave of potentially infected animals coming from Alberta. So the sooner we can get on it, the better chance we'll have. We can apply our resources and our management efforts over a smaller geographic area. Of course, that's going to make us, you know, more effective than if we're dealing with a large geographic area, or if it's spread and has been undetected for a long period of time. And you know, really, at the end of the day, we're trying to buy ourselves some time so that we can continue to learn, develop our tools, develop our team, all those things. The longer we can keep the disease out of the province, the better chance we'll have. And because we're learning so much about it all the time, and we might even have a vaccine one day, right? And fingers crossed for that. It doesn't exist right now, but there's lots of people working on developing something for that. The feasibility of applying that to a wild population is another story, but still, you know, the longer we can buy ourselves some time, the more tools we'll have available to us. So does that answer your question?
It does. Yeah, it does. I guess my question, my follow-up to that would be, what was New York's response that allowed them to potentially eradicate that? What did that look like?
I think they caught it early. They were doing a lot of testing, and they were able to respond very quickly. And so I think what New York did was they, because they were dealing with a very small geographic area, a small outbreak, and they caught it early, it hadn't spread, so they could focus their intensive effort in that small area. And because the disease was introduced, it sort of jumped to that spot. So it wasn't like what we have in Alberta with this wave. I think those examples of having sort of an isolated outbreak is you're going to have a better chance of responding to it if you catch it early enough. So I think that's part of what was so successful, in that they had a plan and a team and a bunch of money ready to go.
That's good. So I guess the only last question that I sort of have as a follow-up is the future of managing CWD in this province when it arrives. I think that hunter training for taking samples and stuff like that, and you and I have chatted about that before with your, you know, videos and things like that, but, you know, hunters can be fairly adept at learning those kinds of techniques to do that. So is that part of that future, you know, say it lands, then we've got it, you know, somewhat spread in herds throughout the province, and then how involved do we get hunters into the actual sampling of it?
Oh yeah, hunters will be integral, absolutely. And the more capacity we have for sampling and testing, we're going to need to get that information and have that information ready and available as quick as possible. So having more people trained to be able to collect those samples and distributed, you know, in the right areas, so that we can get those samples off to the lab as soon as possible. That's all going to be very beneficial. And so Yeah.
It kind of makes me think that a person could almost start stockpiling, roadkill or harvest or things like that, you would have a freezer full of heads to, maybe that sounds a little gross, but a freezer full of heads to actually do that hands-on workshop
yeah.
with people,
Oh,
right? And
Amberly, this is my life. Freezer full of heads. This is my goal. No, absolutely. And that's the key, right? Is anyone can learn how to collect these samples. But yeah, just having those samples available that we can build some training around it. Absolutely. Yeah. And yeah, I encourage, I think I've worked with lots of with clubs and different places that are interested in training, and that's really all it takes is let's round up some heads. Roadkill are great. The trappers have been great at picking up roadkill for us and submitting the heads because they're picking up the roadkill for bait. So we've got lots of samples coming that way, and we all know how many deer get killed on highways in BC. Those are all samples that I would love to get my hands on to increase our sample size. And yeah.
We'll have to work with you on some of that stuff and reaching out and creating some networks in that area. So you know what, it'll be good.
Yeah.
I see no more questions coming up. I have a nice comment from Corey Collins. Thank you very much for the excellent webinar. Glenn Cartwright just wanted to say thanks, Kate, for the great work. So some of those feedback things. For everybody else, we are going to actually edit this recording and have it on our website and our YouTube channel. So it'll be available. We'll send it out via newsletter, social media, all of that kind of stuff, so that everybody can have a chance to share it around with their friends and talk about it. And Kate, thanks for taking time out of your evening. Great presentation. My brain is swirling, I'm sure you can imagine, 25 different directions. I'm dreaming about freezers full of heads.
Let's do it.
There's something weird about that, but
let's build those freezers.
Absolutely.
That would be great. Well, thank you, Amberly, and thank you to Hunters for BC for this opportunity. It's really great to connect with everybody. So please do reach out and contact me directly if you have any follow-ups. Always happy to hear from anyone. So yeah,
you bet.
Thanks so much.
You bet. And thanks to all my participants that showed up tonight. And yeah, I appreciate it. Good night, everybody.
Take care.